He had some pretty interesting things to say about how D&D has evolved over the years.
Definitely, especially about how he thinks the game has changed, like from 3rd edition onward.
Yeah,
And his perspective is, well, let's just say he doesn't hold back.
he really doesn't.
It's refreshing, though, I think, to hear someone who's been so involved in the game. He's so candid about his experiences.
Yeah, it's not sugar-coated.
Yeah, not at all.
One thing that really struck me was his data-driven approach. Like, he's using sales figures as this historical marker for, the reception of each edition, whether it was a success or not.
Yeah, that was interesting, right? I mean, it makes sense, right? Like,
Yeah.
you can see trends, you can see how players reacted to certain changes.
Yeah, you can kind of map it out, the history of D&D, through these sales figures.
Exactly.
And he uses that to illustrate what he calls this boom and bust cycle with 3rd edition.
Right.
It started super strong, everyone loved it, and then, well, something happened.
Well, as Mearls explains it, 3rd edition, it got really complex.
Right.
And even though it was a huge success at first, it might have, alienated some players, especially newer players or more casual players who maybe found it a bit overwhelming.
Too much to keep track of.
Too much, yeah. And you can actually see this in the sales figures. Like, after that initial boom, there's a pretty steep decline.
So it's like, it was popular.
Yeah, they were like, wait a minute, this isn't what we signed up for.
This is too complicated. I like how he connects the dots, though, between, those design choices and the business side of things.
Right.
Because it's not just about the rules. It's about, the whole,
whole ecosystem, the business decisions behind it.
Yeah, exactly.
And he makes this argument that as D&D became, more commercially successful, especially after Hasbro took over,
Right.
there was this shift in focus. Like, he sees it as moving away from what he calls user-centric design towards, decisions that are driven more by, meeting corporate goals than by actually satisfying the players.
Right, like maximizing profit as opposed to
creating a great game. Yeah.
And, he doesn't hold back.
He doesn't.
He calls out some of the executives at Wizards of the Coast.
He does.
Suggesting that their decisions, especially regarding 5th edition, were more about the bottom line than, about making a truly great gaming experience.
That's a bold statement.
It is.
And whether or not you agree with him, it raises some really interesting questions about how a company balances its creative vision with, the need to make money.
The reality of
the business.
Business, yeah.
Absolutely.
Right. So you've got this tension, right?
Yeah.
Between complexity and accessibility, and then you layer on this potential shift in priorities.
Right, at Wizards of the Coast.
Right, exactly.
So where does that leave us in terms of, actual game design?
Well, that's where the old school Renaissance movement comes in.
Okay.
You remember, Mearls was there for the development of 5th edition.
Yeah.
And he acknowledges the influence of the OSR on its design.
Okay, hold on. For those of us who maybe aren't, fluent in D&D history.
Yeah.
What exactly is the old school Renaissance? Break it down for us.
So the OSR, it's this movement within the tabletop RPG community. And it emphasizes going back to, the style and the principles of the older editions of D&D.
Like what?
1st and 2nd edition.
Okay.
Think simpler rules, more player agency.
And a focus on, emergent storytelling.
Okay.
Rather than pre-scripted adventure. And Mearls suggests that there was this deliberate effort to recapture some of that spirit.
Interesting.
In 5th edition.
Which is interesting because, he points out, 5e was initially hailed as this triumphant return to form, a victory for the OSR crowd.
Right.
But now, just a few years later, he's observing that 5e is seen by some as, a bit mainstream, maybe even a little too polished.
It's funny how that happens, right?
Yeah.
It's like this cyclical pattern.
Yeah.
Each new generation of players discovers an older edition, declares it the true D&D, and then the cycle repeats itself.
It's so funny, isn't it?
It is.
Is there even such a thing as a perfect D&D edition? Or is it all subjective, a matter of personal preference and nostalgia?
That's a great question.
It really is.
And I think it speaks to something that Mearls touches on throughout the interview.
Oh, yeah. What's that?
This idea that D&D is more than just a set of rules,
Right.
It's a cultural phenomenon. It's a shared language for storytelling and imagination. And it's constantly evolving.
Right.
But Mearls feels like that evolution has been like stifled in recent years. He uses this term fear of the audience
Oh, wow.
to describe what he sees as like a hesitancy on the part of Wizards of the Coast, to take risks or engage with material that could be seen as controversial.
Yeah, yeah.
He brings up the way they handled orc lore in 5th edition,
Right.
He argues that instead of like reimagining it in a more nuanced way, they basically just sidestepped it.
Yeah, they kind of just like brush it under the rug.
Yeah, good,
Like
good.
it's still there, but they're not really addressing it head on,
And he sees that as a symptom of this broader trend.
Okay.
Where the focus shifts from like creating a truly immersive world to avoiding anything that might trigger backlash or offend certain players.
Right. Playing it safe.
Playing it safe, yeah.
Which, I mean, you can understand why they would do that.
Sure.
But at the same time, it's like, doesn't that limit the storytelling potential?
That's exactly his argument.
Yeah.
He points to, for example, the lack of traditional humanoid monsters in the 5th edition monster manual as more evidence of this trend.
Like avoiding anything that could be perceived as.
Right, like goblins, orcs, those kinds of creatures
Yeah.
that have these like historical baggage,
Yeah, yeah.
He feels like they're playing it so safe that it creates this sense of artificiality.
Right, like a world where certain topics are just off limits.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And he thinks that makes it harder for players and dungeon masters to fully invest in the world.
Yeah, to really buy into it.
Right.
So how do you balance that? Like, how do you balance creative expression with the complexities of, modern social discourse?
There's no easy answer. Mearls suggests that transparency would be a good starting point.
Okay.
And a willingness to, like, acknowledge past mistakes.
Right.
He believes that building trust with the community is essential.
Yeah.
And that involves being open to dialogue and feedback, even when it's critical,
Even when it's not what they want to hear.
Exactly.
Right.
He also advocates for a renewed focus on making the game easier for dungeon masters.
Oh, interesting.
He specifically mentions the monster manual as an area that could be improved.
Okay.
He argues that right now it's more about like manipulating mechanics than crafting compelling narratives.
Right.
He wants to see a return to that focus on player-driven stories where the monsters are more than just stat blocks.
Yeah, they're part of the story.
Right.
Not just like a set of numbers.
Exactly. They should be integral to the narrative.
Right.
And this brings us to a broader point that Mearls makes about the changing landscape of the tabletop RPG industry.
What's that?
He sees a shift towards a direct-to-consumer model.
Interesting.
With the rise of platforms like Kickstarter and online storefronts.
Right. So bypassing the tradition.
Not tech and traditional publishing. Yeah.
Yeah.
And he sees this as a potentially game-changing development.
Like more power to the creator.
Less reliance on those big publishers.
Yeah.
He even uses this analogy of the Unix system administrator to describe this new breed of players and dungeon masters.
An interesting analogy.
It's like they're expert users who know what they need and are capable of like building their own solutions.
Right. They're not waiting for someone to tell them.
Exactly. They're figuring it out for themselves. Right. And with the direct-to-consumer model, those solutions are easier to find than ever before.
That makes sense.
He contrasts this with what he perceives as a growing disconnect between Wizards of the Coast and its players. It's like they're losing touch a little bit.
Yeah, losing touch with that core audience, that made the game what it is.
He uses D&D Beyond as an example.
Okay.
It's a powerful tool, no doubt, but he questions its accessibility, especially for new players. And he highlights the lack of resources for dungeon masters.
Right.
He argues that it's primarily focused on character creation and digital tools, not on supporting the person who's actually running the game.
Okay, so it's like
they're investing in a platform that, while popular, might not be addressing the core needs of people who are most invested.
the heart and soul of the game. So it's almost like there's, betting on the wrong horse, as you said earlier.
Right.
And that leads us to this really interesting thought experiment.
Okay.
What would Mearls do if he were suddenly in charge of Hasbro?
Well, he's pretty clear about that.
All right.
First and foremost, transparency,
Okay.
and acknowledging past mistakes.
Right. Owning up to them.
Owning up to them.
Yeah.
He believes that rebuilding trust with the community is crucial.
Especially after that whole OGL controversy,
Oh, absolutely.
which really shook things up
It did.
and left a lot of people feeling really disillusioned with Wizards.
Yeah, a lot of bridges were burned.
Yeah.
Mearls argues that they need to be honest about their missteps
Right.
and demonstrate a genuine commitment to listening to their audience.
To the players.
To the players,
Yeah. Right, because ultimately they're the ones.
We're the ones who matter.
He also talks about the need for more innovation in D&D's character creation system.
Oh.
He feels that the current subclass structure, while popular, has become kind of stagnant,
Okay.
too focused on combat optimization.
Yeah, min-maxing.
Right, like how do I make my character
Most powerful.
the most powerful? Yeah, instead of like role-playing.
He wants to see more variety, more unique play styles, and a system that encourages players to create characters that feel truly distinct.
Right, that have their own flavor.
Exactly.
Not just cookie-cutter archetypes.
Right. He wants characters that feel like individuals.
So a more player-centric approach.
Yeah, which brings us back to his core philosophy. He wants to see D&D evolve, embrace new ideas,
Push the boundaries.
push the boundaries, yeah.
And move away from this feeling that it's become, like, stuck in a rut.
Yeah, like it's playing it too safe. And this is where his new project comes in, Odyssey.
Ah, yes. Odyssey.
Old
He's
world.
building it from the ground up.
From scratch, incorporating a lot of the ideas and principles he's been talking about.
So it's like his vision for what D&D could be.
Exactly. It's his chance to put his ideas into practice.
I'm excited to see what he comes up with.
Me too.
Yeah, he touches on some, like, really interesting concepts in the interview.
Oh, yeah.
Like having, like, different action economies for each class.
Oh, that's cool.
So it's almost like, you know,
like taking inspiration from video games,
yeah.
where each character kind of plays differently.
Exactly. Yeah, he actually mentions Overwatch specifically
No, interesting.
as an example, you know, where
Right.
each hero has their own unique,
Their own way of moving, attacking.
yeah, like how they interact with the environment. He
Yeah.
wants to capture that same sense of, like, individual character identity
Yeah.
in Odyssey.
So instead of just like, it's your turn, what do you do?
Right.
The game might like present you with options based on,
Tailored to your character.
yeah, tailored to your
Right.
character's abilities.
That's so cool.
Yeah.
So it's not just like a,
One-size-fits-all approach to combat.
right.
He wants each class to feel mechanically distinct.
So cool.
He's also thinking about how to, like, streamline the core system a bit to make combat faster and more fluid.
Okay, so kind of like speed it up a little.
Yeah, exactly.
Get rid of some of the clutter.
Yeah, like he talks about wanting to evoke this feeling of immersion
Mm-hmm.
through the mechanics themselves,
Okay.
rather than relying on, like, super detailed rules for everything.
Right, so let the rules kind of,
Fade into the background.
so it's less about, like, rule following
Right.
and more about just being in the moment.
Exactly. Experiencing the story.
Right.
But even though streamlining is a key focus,
Yeah.
he's not sacrificing tactical depth. He still wants players to feel like their choices matter. Like
Right.
they have, interesting, meaningful options available. He's taken those lessons he learned, from his time at Wizards.
Right.
The successes, the failures.
The good and the bad.
The good and the bad.
Yeah.
And he's applying them to this new project.
It's exciting. It's like, someone with that much experience who's been in the trenches.
Right. He's seen it all.
And now he's trying to, push the boundaries of
what tabletop RPGs can be.
It's inspiring.
It is.
It's like he's not afraid to challenge the status quo and try something new.
That's what we need more of in this industry, People who are willing to take risks and experiment.
It's how the hobby evolves.
That's how we get better games.
Exactly. So,
did you enjoy video? Consider tossing support on my Patreon. It's best way to support orcs. If you would like to see more content, subscribe and post comments below. It better not be bad.
I guess the big question is, what do you want from the future of D&D?
It's a good question.
Do you agree with Mearls' criticisms? Because at the end of the day, it's all about
Having fun.
having fun.
Enjoying the game.
Exactly. So keep those dice rolling and happy adventuring.